yeah, so like Thursday or Friday, I started getting some different news alerts and news articles and everything, just showing like, hey, there's a bank that's tanking, going under,
Mm-hmm.
and everything like that. And so naturally, when you hear that, it is a little bit scary, especially since some big people in finance are like have been predicting, hey, we're about to enter into a recession.
Right.
During a recession, like it's kind of the similar news articles that we were getting in like 2007. Like there's some
Mm-hmm.
warning signs here that we shouldn't ignore. And some people are like all doom and gloom, like
Mm-hmm.
our world is going to upend and be on fire by the end of today.
Mm.
So, and the unfortunate part is when I try not to watch, like when I see a news article that's like breaking news, there's the main people are going to hit it, like CNN, MSNBC, Fox Business, AP News, all those are
Yeah,
going to
like the
hit
big
it with
guys.
like an article, but they don't have all the information. Yeah. So usually what I try and do is I'll try and like kind of get a gist of like what's happening, not if it's good or bad, just like what's actually happening. And then I
Mm-hmm.
try and wait till some different people, usually on YouTube, I usually wait for some different people to post an analysis of, okay, here's what actually is happening. And they're not super hyped up or anything like that. So the Plain Bagel is one of those. So he posted a video either late Saturday night or early Sunday
His
morning.
YouTube channel is the Plain Bagel.
Yeah. And
All
like
right.
imagine a guy. I mean, he's just the most simple, straightforward person, and the jokes he makes are just so subtle. And but his videos aren't flashy at all. It's literally just him in front of a camera, just
Yeah.
talking, and that's it. But I love him because he's like he
He's not
doesn't do
flashy.
anything crazy with his yeah yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say his videos are boring, but they're just straight factual, and so it's really really nice.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a finance background, so his when he talks about something, he's able to explain it in very simple terms, but also like downplay and say, okay, here's where your like crisis should be. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so anyway, so yeah, all these banks. So basically, the largest bank was Silicon Valley Bank, which is one of the
Mm-hmm.
top 10, or it was one of the top 10 or 15 banks in the U.S. as far as deposit holdings. So as far as
It
cash
was
management
that
holdings,
big.
or deposit, yeah. And
I don't think I
so, but
realized it
still
was
regional
that
bank, like
big.
the biggest ones. Yeah. Yeah. So it's pretty big. It's not as big as, JP Morgan or Bank of America or US Bank. It's not that
Mm.
big, but they still consume like there's like four or five players who consume 60% of the market. So it's still fairly large. But the biggest thing that impacted them was that 95% of their deposits from customers were not FDIC insured. So that was the big scary part is this bank had some poor business management, not necessarily financial management. Like nothing was illegal. There's some sketchy things that happened, but there's nothing illegal that like necessarily right now that they were doing.
Yeah,
Besides,
I got a
um,
clarifying question for you.
go ahead.
Isn't it? I had read they didn't have a senior vice president for risk management. Like they didn't have anybody at the top position for the risk management position for like 2 years.
Yeah, yeah. Which it's hard to say if a person in that position would have actually been able to adjust their profile because the part that went bad for them was that they were invested in U.S. Treasury bonds,
Mm-hmm.
which are the safest things in the market because you trust the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
government. But the problem was is that because they had invested in these when the interest rates were low, once interest
Mm-hmm.
rates started rising, every
Yeah.
time they had to sell these bonds to actually pay their customers who were making deposits, they had to take it as a loss. So I think at the
Mm-hmm.
start, the 1st of March, they announced, hey, we're going to have to sell at a $2.2 billion loss
Yep.
and sell these assets. Now, they also just released their financials and said, all these other assets we expect to actually make money on in 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
But they had to sell them
Yeah.
early because people saw this in California. All these Silicon Valley companies are like, hey, let's just go and start pulling our money out. And then all of a sudden, they just have to cash this at a greater loss and then a greater loss. So it just kept happening. And so
Mm-hmm.
normally that wouldn't happen. And that the thing is that their financials, they just got audited like a month ago and they're fine. And so their financials technically are okay. But it's just kind of like an unprecedented thing, kind of like a black swan event that you wouldn't necessarily expect to happen. Like if you're reading a textbook and you're like managing a company, you're like, no, this is probably a safe thing to do. Like even the auditors were like kind of blindsided by this, but um, it
I
just
don't
shows
know.
that when things change this fast.
Well, the reason I would say I don't know,
What?
I don't remember too much from my bond valuation accounting class in intermediate accounting too, but I do remember our professor like adamantly saying bonds are safe, treasury yields are safe unless interest rates are low. It's like don't buy them when they're low because you had to go through and you had like calculate how it would affect bond yields, and if every time that interest rate goes up, bonds
Yeah,
just like plummet. He's like don't. So like that's I don't remember much. I remember that, and I remember
yeah,
like Blackstone's modeling or whatever, but um still you
yeah.
bank it.
Well, in general, they have them
U.S. Treasury.
diversified.
Mm-hmm. It's supposed to be the safest
Yeah,
bond
they're
you
supposed to
can
be
buy is the
safe.
U.S. Treasury.
Yeah.
That's wild.
And so and they usually have them diversified and stuff, but they start to realize, yeah, we're kind of like in over our heads with this, and because they just went up much faster and they're not diversified. So most of their
Mm-hmm.
client base are the exact same people. They're all neighbors. They're all these
Mm-hmm.
companies in Silicon Valley. And so as soon as one person in the industry starts saying, maybe we should back out of this, maybe we should withdraw some cash, everybody's saying that they're friends. They're all going out to lunch together. It's all the same people within a 10 square miles that are all
Right.
saying the same thing versus like JP Morgan, who's like, they're across the world. And so they have like, even if this happened in one industry, nothing, it wouldn't happen that much. And so
Mm.
there is some questionable things that how a lot of their executives sold out of the stock of the company 2 weeks ago. So
No
they're getting
way.
investigated because, yeah, so it was right before they posted that they were going to have to sell this off um, and issue new stock. So it's like they were just taking a safe bet, but it's going to be like this is kind of illegal. It's not. Well, the thing is, it's not necessarily illegal. If this didn't happen, it wouldn't be legal or investigated. But because it
Yeah.
happened, now they're like, "Are you misleading shareholders?"
Yeah. It looks like an insider.
All
It looks like
all
insider
this other
trading.
stuff. So it's yeah. I mean, basically, they kind of knew what was happening, and they got out while they could, and so. But the nice thing is, I was really happy to hear yesterday that Janet Yellen, head of the Treasury, announced that they would not do a bailout and they were going to let the bank fail, but all depositors will be have their funds secured, which is like the best of both worlds
Mm-hmm.
because then to bail them out would be a ton of money but they're just selling off all their
Mm-hmm.
assets and paying all the depositors back. And they say
Yeah.
there's not going to be any taxpayer money involved. We'll see if that actually follows through, but
That's never true.
so
All of the government's money is taxpayer money.
I mean, yeah,
Like,
yeah. So, but hopefully they keep it to the staff members who are handling this situation for the next 2 months. Their salaries are the only taxpayer money that are involved. That's what
mm,
it should be. We'll see what actually
yeah.
happens, and I mean,
But
investigation
everybody's
goes
getting
on.
their
So,
deposits.
but yeah, that's yep. Everybody. So everybody today everybody this morning. As soon as banks opened, everybody who was FDIC insured got their money back, and then everybody else would get it by the end of the week, if
Are
necessary.
they are they capping it at the FDIC maximum, or are they going beyond the FDIC maximum?
So for the insured, they're not going beyond. For the uninsured, they're selling off assets that the bank owned in order to pay depositors back with their cash.
Oh, that's good. Okay,
So
so
they're
they're
not
not
taking
like
out, they're not printing any money. They're not, go ahead.
okay. Well, that's good because you always wonder like
That's
you said they're a top 10 bank, so they had how much on deposit?
um, I mean, a couple, like almost 100 billion or something.
Yeah, and
But
FDIC is only up to
um,
250,000.
yeah.
That sucks.
So it was 16th in the country by assets at the end of 2022.
Okay.
So
Wow,
yeah. So
that's a
and people, a
rough
lot of people are
weekend.
worried about like, yeah, yeah. And so a lot of people were scared for their jobs because they're like, well, my company had money there and
Right.
payroll that comes out on the 15th. Can they actually withdraw money to pay me? And so a lot of like people were super worried about it. And, but it looks like it's not actually going to, there's no recourse effect except for other businesses that were in ties with this company. So like I got notices from my bank. I
Mm.
don't know if you did. I got notices from my banks that just said we don't have any association with this company. Like we've worked with them, we're partners in the industry, but none of your funds are in any sort of
Mm.
investments or anything with this bank.
Mm.
Basically, just assuring that like my money's safe. And so
Right.
I think overall,
Yeah, we wouldn't have
it
got.
could have been a lot worse.
Well, I guess we'll probably see what else
But
the other
yeah,
fallout is. See how the public reacts.
yeah. I mean, there's some other banks who it looks like they might have been somewhat tied to it. So some other regional banks, some smaller banks have had some trickle down effect, but it doesn't look like it's that big, I think, from what I can tell. But I'll wait to
Mm.
see if some of my financial YouTuber gurus post some update videos this week. So,
Well, we're
yeah, so
11 and
that's
a
what
half
I've been
minutes
reading. That's
into
what
the
I've been researching
podcast.
mostly.
Oh, just so you
Yeah.
know, there's a little bit of a
So,
delay as it tries to upload. Right now, our Wi-Fi is getting crushed by the cold weather out there. We're expecting like 10 inches of snow, so
okay.
there's a little bit of a delay on the Wi-Fi. Um, so just so you're aware, when it uploads, it'll be fine. But we're 12 minutes into the podcast, and I asked Collin. This is my brother Collin. He did the eighth most listened to podcast on the Man I Want to Be podcast, talking about video games, and he's always collecting articles and interesting information about what's happening in the world. So I was like, first thing I asked him before I hit record was like, "What are you learning is interesting right now?" And it just happens to be the same week that a bank collapsed in California, and he was his and Audrey is an auditor, and his wife Audrey is an auditor, and so she got to explain a bunch of stuff to him, and what a weekend. We'll see how that goes. Have you seen the movie Margin Call?
Yeah.
So you know, yeah, the when you said like 10 square blocks, they all talk to each other, that my mind immediately went to Margin Call. And like, you got to be first, and they all start selling. And have you seen the movie The Big
Yeah.
Short?
Yeah. That's it. That's actually, oh, yeah. Yeah. Yep. Own both those movies. Watched them actually probably each 3 or 4 times, just because I
Mm-hmm.
find them so interesting and fascinating. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, that's those the regulations that passed after 2008 and 2009 are what allowed the U.S. Treasury and the bank regulators to actually act before this weekend and this past weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's just like nice when you see something that actually a pretty terrible crisis that I mean impacted the U.S. but also impacted the world. Everybody who uses the U.S. dollar as a currency was impacted 10 times the amount as the U.S. in 2008 and 2009. So
Wow.
um, the fact that we put in a regulation that has unfortunately has been put to the test and it has worked out pretty well. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's been localized to one or a couple banks and very, very few people in total, like actual U.S. citizens. And hopefully that if there is any wrongdoing or anything like that, because there's not huge financial backlash, they're able to get to the investigations and actually, you know, put people on under the microscope to make sure that they're still being ethical and moral with their businesses.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so
I was going to ask you in regards to that. Do you know who Ray Dalio is?
yeah,
Have you read his book or heard of his book, Principles for Navigating a Changing World Order?
yeah,
You have read it?
Yeah, yeah, I've read it, and I watched it. I share the video with a lot of people a lot on YouTube.
Okay, so haven't met anyone other than me who's read that book, and I've thought it was fascinating. So for those of you who are just listening, Ray Dalio, he wrote that book, big old book called, I think it was just called Principles, and it was just different principles for life. But then he wrote another book called Principles for Navigating a Changing World Order. I think that's the exact title of it, and it's basically an economic analysis of money in history across different empires. Um, what was the Northeast India Trading Company? He looked at them, the Dutch, the British, and then the United States, and then I also China, right? He looked at all of these, like what happens when currency changes, and
Yeah, he's looking to see. He's predicting that if the U.S. no longer becomes the ruling world order on the financial system economically, that China will take over, um, and not necessarily that they'll like run the world, but they'll have economic power that the U.S. has held since World War II, basically.
yeah, they'll be the reserve currency primarily,
Mm-hmm.
and take over probably the
Yeah,
IMF and
and yeah, so it'll be interesting to see because um, starting a business in like the 1920s, even when we were doing well economically after World War One, and the 1920s still wasn't easy as it is today because it's very easy to get access to finance and funds. And when if that changes, I think we'll still have the U.S. that is will still have a very strong currency and have still a very strong economic system, but they won't be in charge of the world. And so some of our finances will change, and it'll actually be like similar to how like Germany operates. Germany is one of the top economies in the world, but they're not, and they have a very similar system to us, but they're not nearly as strong as us as far as business development and stuff, because money just doesn't move as quickly when yours is not the national or the world currency, basically.
yeah, yeah. This stuff's like fascinating to like look into. Um, I think that book by Ray Dalio is a great like introduction to like money and economics, and the world is not always going to be the way you understand it, like, or the way you got to live it. Like it could change. And it's changed over and over and over and over again. Which is, I think it was very, I think it's a very sobering book. Um, you know what else was? I've telling everybody about this book. Have you heard of the book Age of Entitlement?
Yeah, it actually just popped up on my news feed. Man, who was talking about it? Um, oh, actually, you know what? I think I heard about it, and then I was listening to the podcast that you and Dylan did for his channel. I was
Mm-hmm.
just listening to that Friday, maybe when I was driving, and
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I heard you guys talking about it a little bit as well.
Yeah, I'm re-listening to it for the second time. It is. I've read a lot of historical analysis of the United States, and it is the single best analysis of the United States since 1960s that I've ever read. Guaranteed to sober up every single person who reads it, no matter what you think about the U.S. Left, right, blue, red, middle, like if you're a Reagan fan, that book's gonna make you not a Reagan fan because it is so well written. Um, like
Yeah.
it is. I could not believe how good that book was, and it's like a smack in the face to like, here's the consequences of everything you've ever done for the last 60 years. And yeah, I can't recommend that book enough. You should buy it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting because I feel like it's either I feel like I read a part of it like in a bookstore one time, and then or I think I heard about it on a podcast or something, and I saw it in a bookstore, so I read like a little bit of it, and then someone else was talking about it and how important it is just for like you said, framing your mind, framing your perspective when you're thinking about current choices as an individual, current choices
Mm-hmm.
um, as a community or as a country, and how they do have consequences, and they have lasting consequences much longer than people think. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes consequences don't actually show up right away. They take a long time to happen. And it's like throwing a baseball really far off a cliff. You
Mm-hmm.
can watch it for like 10 to 20 seconds and it hits the ground, or um, and it just takes a long time sometimes for consequences to happen.
Yeah.
And when you're thinking about things on a long term scale, it's kind of hard to kind of hard to see that. But and but yeah, actually, for back on that principles book, I used to use that as when I would every year I talk about the first portion. So he talks about principles that he had in his life, or the second part, he talked about how he developed principles, Ray Dalio, and then he talked about how he applied those principles to his life and everything. I used to use that as when I would do residence life training on campus.
Oh,
I
really?
used to use that book as how, yeah, in life you're just going to have a lot of different circumstances that you run into, and you can't be prepared for all of them, but you can always be prepared to have a framework to solve them and how to react to them. And it helps you stop from being reactionary if you can have, like, you always take a time to pause no matter what, and before you decide, before you speak. And if you take that time, you build that framework out, then you're just going to be able to operate in life way better,
Mm-hmm.
and just be able to go a lot smoother through life, I think.
Yeah. I know Dylan liked that book. I've never read it, um, but I've the only book by Ray Dalio that I've read is that Principles for Principles for Changing World Order, not his original principles. But maybe I'll have to check that out because I do. Yeah, the framework of principles um, is very very helpful because you can't like, especially otherwise you're just reacting, like you said. What else are you reading? Anything else that's interesting? Because you are always collecting. Oh, I wanted one more comment because you like Malcolm Gladwell. I like Malcolm Gladwell. Age of Entitlement reads like a Malcolm Gladwell book. Like
Oh, okay.
great that like it's that kind of book where it's like out of it's not just not what you would expect when you read it. Um, and this guy, the guy who wrote it, he's written one book before this one, and I couldn't even tell you. It was like $70. It
Hmm.
looked like a textbook. Um, he's a journalist of I forget where he's a journalist at, but he's written two books in his life, and this one just like took off. But yeah, it
Oh,
reminded
that's
me of like
interesting.
a it reminded me of a Malcolm Gladwell type of book. Are you all
Gotcha.
right? What else are
Huh.
you collecting?
um I mean,
I
right
want to
now,
ask.
like, I'm actually reading a lot about. Go ahead.
I was going to say, if you don't have anything, I want to ask you about Chat GPT.
um, well, actually, yeah. So, most of the stuff I've been reading right now has just been for like work, but um, because probably the worst aspect of my job, as far as like what I'm best at versus what I'm worst at, is just recruiting and just being a salesman. And people don't like it when I say I'm a salesman, but I am because I have to recruit players to my program, but also to my university.
And
And
remind people what
so
you do.
um, I'm an esports coach for a small Christian university in Nebraska. So if you know anybody who plays video games and they're pretty good, and they want to go to Christian school, then hit me up. But
I've got somebody for you, but he's
hashtag
currently
not an ad.
13.
Um, hey, 3 years for 4 years. Um, but yeah, so I've been listening to a lot about selling a product, because that's what I'm doing, and I have to package it that way, and I have to reframe how I do it. But also, I'm having to teach myself skills that I'm not good at.
Mm.
And so there's there's a lot of other things that I'm good at, but when it comes to actually building a customer, like relationship with a customer and selling a product that is, it's not a one-time thing. It's a big heaping thing that takes, it's a 4-year college degree. A lot of times I'm talking to people outside Nebraska. They've never been to Nebraska. They don't want to come to Nebraska. I tell them how it's negative 20 degrees and they're not interested, or we're in a small town, or all these different things. And so I have to highlight um, I have to one, not be so honest that I just tell people all the bad things because they ask about them. But also I have to frame it like what's the strengths that the program has, what do I have, what does the school have, everything like that, and how do I frame it. So I've been reading a lot about like salesmanship and how also not to be a like the typical stereotypical dishonest salesman, because I do want people to succeed and I want people to know that we're like a Christian institution and we have that mindset, and that's the forefront of our mission. But also we get to do some cool things on the side, like esports. And so trying to put those together. And so I've been reading a lot of stuff about selling products, and I've been watching a lot of like YouTube videos, and I've been listening to podcasts about recruiting and different trends in recruiting and how things have changed, like even before COVID, and how a lot of the material that was taught has changed, and people are uncomfortable about maybe leaving their family or being away far away from family, or cost is a big thing. um, and so just approaching it in a different way um, than what I normally would, because I'm not necessarily a people person, but now it's like 65 to 70% of my job is just talking to people all the time, and most of the time they're going to tell me no. And so dealing with that rejection of, and I have to change the frame set, or the framing of my mind is that it's not that they're rejecting me, they're choosing a better option for themselves, and
Hmm.
I'm just one option on their plate, and I have to present myself in the best light. But also, if I have somebody who comes to my program, who comes to our school, our university, they don't do well, they're not ready academically, or we don't have their program, or um, they have better options out there for them. Um, I want to just be an option that they choose, and when I get the right people, we know they're the right people and they succeed, rather than come here and they're kind of mediocre. And um, and luckily, I have an admission staff and a supervisor who agrees with me on that point, that we want the right people, not a lot of people. So
Right.
that's
Well, okay.
that's a lot
So
of what I've been reading. Um,
you just said two things. Speaking of principles derived from just Ray Dalio, but just in general, based on you said two things that I stuck. I was like, oh, okay, that's a principle just for life. One, you talked about you have to having to get better at something you're not naturally good at so that you can do your job. And two, you said they're not rejecting me; they're making a better decision for themselves. Which I would like to come back to that one. But so you like your job. There's aspects of your job that you're not naturally gifted at, but you because to do your job well, you need to get better in that area. So I like that because a lot of the guys I talk to, they'll like, yeah, I'm just not passionate about this portion, or I'm not good at that. Maybe that's for someone else. They almost like um, self sabotage themselves because there's something they're just not good at. When in life, there's a lot that you're just not good at, and it takes a little bit of effort, a little bit of study to grow in that area. There's almost this like over specialization that people are after. So could you like you're trying to get better at your job so you can do your job better, even though it's not natural.
yeah, that was actually something that took me a little bit to realize. So I started this job 2 years ago, basically about 26 months ago. I started this job. Um, and a lot of it I thought was, well, I need to, learn all these video games. I need to, have this structure built, this practice structure, this organization. And I'm a coach. I got to show these leadership skills. I got to show how to do a practice. I got these different teams I got to manage. Um, and, but it turns out that was a very small portion of the job. Like, it's still
Mm-hmm.
very, very important. Um, and those things make for a successful program. But if you don't have people in your program, it's not successful.
Right.
So, and I have people who graduate. I have people who maybe don't do so well academically, so they can't come back. So I got to replace these, and I gotta work on this. But I found out that this part that I'm the worst at, also unluckily enough, is the part I like hate the most.
Yeah.
And like
You're like,
just
dang
knowing
it.
that I have to cold call people sometimes. Yeah. And I just got to cold call, and I just got to like sit on there, leave a voicemail, hang up, do it again. And that's what I had to do. I don't have to do it as much anymore. But in the first year, that's what I had to do because it was a brand new program that didn't have any established players or anything. I had to build it from scratch. Um, so I just had to take a different approach to it of I had to change my mindset, know, okay, what are the aspects of this job that I like, and how much of my time is actually spent there. And I think probably with most people, the parts of their job that they love, that they absolutely love, that make them, even after a terrible day, that will make them wake up again and say, yeah, this job is worth it no matter what. It's like maybe 5 to 10% that they actually love. There's probably a lot of things that you like about your job, but actually love about your job is probably very, very small. And I think a lot of times people hope that they can find a job that 80% of their job they love. And that's it's just not a reality. Um and there's always just going to be portions that you just don't like, and sometimes those are big portions. But for me, I just started to think about what are the things that I absolutely love about my job, um, and the things that came to mind were when I have players who show growth as individuals, not necessarily as players, um, but they come from different communities, they come from different parts of the world, and they come in all sorts of different stages of their life. And but when I have a player who they I can just see that they just get it. They stop and they talk to me and they ask me about their faith, because and I knew that they've been questioning it, but now they had a Bible class, there was a devotional, there's something where it just kind of clicked with them, and they're like, okay, maybe I do have a future here with Christ. What does that
Mm,
look like? So
wow.
that for me is big. But also like when like I'm putting all these hours in, and when I have a student who just writes me a thank you note, just one thank you note that just says, hey, just thanks for taking me to Walmart. And
Hmm.
it's not even like I don't mind doing it. I could take 100 people to Walmart and they never say thank you. I don't really care. It's just
Hmm.
if they need to go there, I'll take them. But when they go out of their way and they do something that's out of character for them,
Hmm.
when I know how different it is for them, and they just really appreciate the benefit of not just me, but of the program, of the school, everything like that. I'm like, yeah, I'll call 1,000 more people and get told no to get one player who comes here, who establishes their faith or grows in their faith, um, and it's worth it, and it's worth it every single time. And so I have to keep those things in the back of my mind as motivation when I'm listening to a podcast about the optimal time or the optimal conversations to have over the course of 10 months with a high school student and their parents, you know, in October when I'm not even going to see them on campus until the next August, and having those conversations. And it's like, I don't want to, I just want to go watch Smash Brothers replays. That's what I want to do.
Right.
I don't want to sit here and like call people or listen to this podcast while I'm exercising or whatever.
Right.
Um, but that's it's just like you have to put like you know what is worth it, and what does it take to get there. And also, if people think about quitting their jobs, which is perfectly fine, but if you think about quitting your job or moving on to a different role or whatever, say, am I willing to give this up, and will I actually be able to achieve this aspect in another job, this part
Hmm.
of your job that you love or that you feel valued in or whatever. And I think a lot of times people need to frame their mindsets, and I learned this through a lot of different jobs, is that sometimes the job that you have is not the best job you could be doing. It's not the best career that you could have. It's not the best job you could have, but you are the best person at this time for this job.
Yeah.
And there's a reason why you need to be there. You are there either as a supervisor, a manager, just a basic employee, but you work hard, you show up on time, and you actually make your manager's day so much easier. You make your employees' days so much better. Whatever it is, sometimes we get put in situations in our life where we always think about, man, I feel like I'm not doing the best I could. I feel like I could be doing something better. I'm not enjoying this so much. But if you step back and think, am I making an impact at the cost of my own enjoyment or time? Am I making an impact in the lives of others? And then you're like, oh, actually, probably I am. All right, this actually isn't that bad. And I'm getting paid to do it, to provide for myself, my family, whatever. But you just have to flip it sometimes and think about it as, how am I benefiting the world around me? Because ultimately, that's why we choose jobs. And anybody who says they want to not have a job and just retire is lying, because they end up finding work anyway, most people. And so it's just about finding the impact that you enjoy making, not necessarily about the work that you're doing on a day to day. So
You described the entire movie, It's a Wonderful Life, with those statements. Like, his brother's all off on adventure and doing great stuff, and he's stuck in that little town, and but he's making all the impact in the world. And he's so dissatisfied because he's not paying attention to what he's doing. Yeah, I mean, I've said it a few times on my podcast and with guys I meet. Like, one thing I say is, like, eventually work becomes work. You might love it for a month, but eventually work becomes work. You like it for a year, but it eventually becomes work. But also, it's amazing how much of your job you'll like if you start trying really, really hard. Even if you're like, I'm not passionate about it. It's like, well, yeah, try really hard. You might become passionate about it. It's amazing what happens when you try really, really hard at whatever's in front of you. And there's also, we live in a Genesis 3 kind of world where there is, so you know how in Genesis 3 it says you will work by the sweat of your brow? So, or you will bring food forth by the sweat of your brow. It basically means like you'll work in anxiety, meaning your work will not be as satisfying as you want it to be. And which is why when you start looking, when you get, I've been thinking about this because everybody's really like, I've got to figure out my purpose. I remember I was there. I'm like, I got to figure out my purpose. It's like an all consuming thought, which is a privilege of being on Maslow's hierarchy, like the very top end. You get to say, but it's like when that's what you have to find you have so many options, it becomes like almost this different kind of burden. And it's solved by figuring out how you can do the best job where you're at with whatever you have. And then opening your eyes to see what kind of impact you're making around you. And that's where the gold is.
mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, I mean, you had texted me, I mean, a few weeks ago, a month ago or whatever, about different topics for this podcast and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And talked about like people, just coming out of college.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how many people I've met who A, want to drop out of college, or B, want to change their major, or once they graduate, they're like, oh, I don't like this. I hate this. What's wrong
I
with me?
did all three.
Yeah. But it happens. And it's okay. And it's scary, but it's okay that happens, because it's just a natural thing that you experience. A lot of people experience in college the fact that they now get to make choices for their life that have impacts, and they don't like them, because the first big change that a lot of people actually can remember and recognize is going from middle school to high school. You don't get a choice. You're going somewhere. I don't care if you're homeschooled or private school or public school. You have to go, and you're going to hate it, but it's not your fault. You didn't make that choice. You can hate your parents for moving into this school district, or you can hate your teachers for the homework. You can hate whatever you want. As soon as you choose to go into a job after high school, or you choose to go to college, or even after you graduate college, you choose to go to a job or career or whatever. Now that it's your choice, it sucks even more when it's not a good choice, or you don't think it's a good choice,
because you have no one to blame.
Yeah, and you're like, you try, and I think that's what happens to a lot of people. And I think it's natural, but at the beginning,
I need to pause you real quick. I want you to say what you first said again, because that was like really, really, really profound. You said most people don't have to. I think you said you don't have to make your own choices until you go to college, because you can blame somebody else. That's the first time you really have responsibility for your choices. and it now sucks because you have the responsibility that comes with freedom of choice. Is basically
Yeah.
what you said.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, and once you
Jeez.
have that choice, you're like, it sucks. And I think a lot of people in college or they're early in their life, probably from ages 17 through, I'd say even 24, 25, they, and, and they, you now have these consequences that you have to deal with and you can't find who to blame. So you look around and there's very, very few people who actually can blame someone else. Like, oh, they were, their parents made them go to a school. Sometimes that happens or whatever. So you can blame somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or, you got married at a young age. So you're just having to go into a job that you didn't want to necessarily. There's a lot of things that you can blame. But I think ultimately what ends up happening is the sooner you can decide, I have to pay my consequences. I have to pay the dues for these choices that I've made. I think people just get set, not like they're just resolved and they're happy. They're just become at peace with the fact that when they make a decision, it's their decision. But when you make a good decision, it means so much more.
Yeah.
It like means everything because you made that good decision and it wasn't forced for you. And there's a lot of, it's funny because there's a lot of articles and stuff. How people talk about how millennials or Generation Z, they're taking longer to mature. And this is like something like psychological studies you can do. There's actually changes in the development of the brain. There's a biological change. There's a sociological change of people who, they get out of college and they come back home and live. Or maybe they don't go to college right away and they live with their parents. Or they live at home and they have all these different things. And that's happening more and more. And people are that adolescent time period that usually or that used to stop around 17 or 18 is now being extended to 22, 24, 26. And there's a lot of different factors. It's not just a personal choice. There's a psychological development change. There's a biological development change. And there's a sociological development change that's happening. And it's kind of hard to blame any one generation. But I remember reading an article about it. I don't know, when I was in high school or when I was in college or something. But
Do you think you
if
could
you,
give three examples real quick? I can think of one of like a socioeconomic reality that forces people back home, and that's like just the cost to live. Like buying a house in 1970 was on average twice your annual income. That was the price. So if you made 60,000, you typically bought a house that was 120,000, and there were houses that were that. Now the average is about 10 times your average annual salary,
yeah,
which is nuts. Like how are you supposed to buy a house that's 10 times, unless you live in York,
Mhm.
Nebraska. Where's
Yeah. Ooh. But yes, I would say so. Like a biological change is so a lot of hormones are controlled by the pituitary gland, and
mm,
so how it releases hormones and when it releases hormones um, changes when a person develops. So, for example, if you look at, and you can't do studies like biological studies this far back, but you can look at cortisol levels, which is a way that you can measure stress and everything. So, if you think
mm-hmm,
about somebody who they were 16 years old
mm-hmm,
and they weren't going to school in 1915. They were working. Usually, they were working the family trade.
mm-hmm.
They didn't get a choice of what to do, and so they, or if you wait 15 years later, 1930, everything's good 2 years ago, and now it's not so good,
Really?
and like the economy, the Dust Bowl, everything is gone, and you are having to adjust to that. Well, those people matured very, very, very fast because they had to. They
Right.
didn't have a choice. Like, and it wasn't a parental choice. Parents were just like, we have no other choice except to make you go out and work at 12 years old in the
Right.
dust. And you're just like, okay, I guess this is reality because everybody else is doing it.
Yeah.
But now, so that's like one thing is like people just were forced to do, the life circumstances were different. So they were
And it had a
forced to work.
biological effect.
Yes.
Okay.
And so you can actually measure stress levels and stuff. And the biggest evidence of this is people who went off to war in 1918 or like 1916 or 1940 was they're put in life situations where they just had to mature so much faster.
Hmm.
But the difference is that their parents weren't in war necessarily. There's not a lot of people who are their parents were in the First World War and then the Second World War, but there's just just enough of a gap where people weren't necessarily having the same psychological consequences of this. And then you see it again in like the 60s and 70s of that. Now these like parents are coming back with who they're having kids in a wartime situation and not the best economic situations, but people are struggling more with realities that they're just presented with in their life. And so you see slowly basically what becoming an adult starts to change, because you get more choices in life, but also because life gets a little bit better. And so because it gets better and you're not forced to do all these things as a child, you're actually able to go to high school and get an education. And now you have options on what to do. And I'm specifically talking about post World War II now, but you have options that you didn't have before, that your parents didn't have, that your grandparents didn't have. And so their only choice, like a 20-year-old in 1918, just had to be an adult. But being adult did not mean, investing in stocks. It did not mean
Yeah.
buying a house. You inherited a house, or
Mhm.
you worked on a farm and you were provided housing, and then you eventually bought a house. But slowly, I think just realities have changed a little bit, and I think. Go ahead.
So it's almost like wealth actually slows down how fast you have to grow up. Like as a nation gets richer and more options become available, it actually slows down how fast you have to grow up. Interesting.
Um, yeah, I mean, because like if every generation is on average wealthier than the generation before it, even with financial crisis of the 1980s, 1990s,
Yeah.
2000s, 2008, it's always wealthier because there's more money. We just get more efficient as an economy, as a society. We get more efficient. Wealth may not be distributed equally, but it's but everybody on a whole gets richer and healthier, and you can actually live as a child longer, and so developmental stages are stretched out. So people are like, it's funny that people sometimes look at how millennials or Generation Z, their childhood gets extended past age 17 and goes up to now 24 or 25. But then you look at retirement on the other side, it's like, yeah, well, people also are living retirement a lot longer.
Right.
And then people are like, well, how come I have to work so much longer? It's like, well, you were dying at 68, 50 years ago. So, if you want to live this, they didn't have a retirement because there wasn't retirement. It was work, and then you're just dead. And so that's like, it didn't like matter anymore. And people are like, well, now I got to work, and I want to like then I got to spend 20 years. I want to spend 20 years in retirement. Why do I have to work for this long? It's like, you now have the choice not to. Like, you can live a much more simpler life, a less wealthy life if you want, and retire early, or you can go to a different country. You just have more options now. So the comparisons that happen are much more out there. And this is like social media and like globalization is the biggest thing that started to happen with the internet, is that you can actually know what's happening anywhere in the world at any time. So you can know how your situation is relative to everybody else's very, very quickly. And so it makes you think that your life is much, much worse, when before you could just compare the dude that's a quarter mile down the dirt road. And you're like, hey, well, I got 2 goats and he's only got 1. So I'm
Yeah,
fine.
that's probably the single most detrimental thing that's happened is the ability to compare yourself to the world.
Yeah.
Like, so would you say we'll circle back because you're talking about responsibility when you are post college, you have to make your choices for the first time. So the fastest way to grow up, whether you are rich or poor, no matter the circumstances, no matter the biological, the socioeconomic, or anything, the fastest way to grow up is actually to take on as much responsibility as you can handle at that moment, because that'll force you to grow up.
Yeah, I think, yes, like technically, yes, you could, and you could find the perfect amount of responsibility, where you could like fine tune the cortisol levels that your brain is developing, and so that you get just the right amount of acute stress and just the amount of chronic stress so you can be an adult as soon as possible. Um, but um, I think the we and this is kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is sometimes as humans we have a hard time realizing when things are changing and we don't want them to change. um,
Yes.
for example, like you were talking about houses, everybody wants to own a house because that's what you could do 50 years ago. You didn't own a house.
Well,
um,
like 60 years ago, 50 years ago was the 70s, and that was a terrible time to try to buy a house.
oh yeah, yeah. Okay, so yeah, so
But
but if you
not
go
just to
back,
be semantical.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, but you like it wasn't necessarily normal to own a house or to own property 200 years ago. Like it's a very new thing to own property.
Yep.
And a lot of people would rent or they'd live with family, like a very communal living aspect. And now it's like, no, I want to own a house just with me and my wife, and we don't have kids yet, but we got a cat. And this should be a normal thing for me to own a 4 bedroom 2 bath house because I live. And it's like, well, yes, I mean, if you want it all to be fair across time, sure, it's not going to happen because also you need polio if you want it to be fair. Um, like, I think people just get confused of like how, like, hey, as time advances, we should get more good things and less bad things. And I think it's pretty historical and biblical to say, no, you just get different good things and different bad things.
Yeah.
Like, it's just how it goes.
Yeah, you're
Um,
not gonna escape bad stuff. And sorry to circle back to Age of Entitlement, but the basic premise of that book was like the first half starts with the socialistic utopia and sexual revolution of utopia, and basically says Reagan was after the same utopia, but it was economic. And he's like, it's two sides of the same coin. Like, it'll blow your mind because it's like, get rid of as much bad as possible so everybody can have utopia. It's like, you can't do that.
yeah,
You live in a fallen world.
yeah. Yeah, well, and to go back on to your point about responsibility, I think what happens is people, um, I think what it means to be responsible changes, and I think people get confused on what, um, like the cost of responsibility. Because I think people say like, oh yeah, I'm fine. I want to own a house, or I want to have like a good income, or I want to have a family, but they forget that these things have serious costs and consequences
Mm-hmm.
that you have to be prepared for and that you're not going to like.
Yeah.
Um, I hate shoveling my walk. I can't stand it. And I was just talking with my wife today how we have to build a retaining wall on our front lawn because it's just falling apart and the dirt's just sliding down onto the sidewalk. And I'm like, well, this is what we got to do. If I was renting a house or renting an apartment,
You
I
call the
wouldn't have to do
landlord.
it. Yeah. And this isn't my problem. Like, and so, but that's what I want. And now I just got married 8 months ago, and now I have to be aware and be responsible for taking care of her and being responsible for our schedules
Mm-hmm.
and making sure we're spending time with each other. And it's a very, very good thing. And it's just, I'm willing to pay that consequence and the pain, or pay the cost of that responsibility of
Yeah.
being married. And, um, and so I think, as people change and as society changes as a whole, the costs and the consequences change.
Yeah.
And um, I think it makes it harder to know when things aren't fair,
Mm-hmm.
because you can look at your friends and it could be, maybe they're really not traveling to Bali every weekend, but it sure looks like they are. And I
Yeah,
don't
they took
like that.
200 pictures and they just post one a week for a
Yeah.
year.
Yeah, and it's like, oh well, Elon Musk was just worth $350 billion, and I only have 200 in my account. That doesn't seem fair. Well, JD Rockefeller had way more money than the dude building the rails, but you just didn't know that he was worth that much.
Right.
You may not have, like, probably didn't even know who he was. Like, you were working for him, and so just the knowledge becomes like just so unfair. Um, but with that knowledge, like now, um contributions to people who live a life that's less than you weren't possible before globalization. Like if you wanted to support a missionary
Mm-hmm.
in India, and you didn't know what they were doing or what their needs were, because it took 2 months to get a letter back, and by
Mm-hmm.
that time things have changed. And
Yeah.
like, but now you can actually contribute to these things. You can know about bad things and good things that are happening so fast. And I think too bad we look at like, oh, look at all these things that are good that are not happening to me, without looking at, well, here's all the good that I can do for the world around me.
Mm.
And so I think people kind of forget like that we have so many options now today in our world, um, to benefit the world around us, and we kind of don't think about them in the same way we think about bad things. Like we think about
Yeah.
good things differently than we think about bad things, and it's just it's hard to train your mind to think that way.
Yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely.
it takes time.
Well, so I think we live in like a Deuteronomy 8 kind of world. Deuteronomy 8 is basically God's warning to Israel. He's like, look, you're going to end up in a place in houses you did not build, with vineyards that you didn't plant and wine that you didn't like reap, and you're going to have wealth that you didn't ask, and you're going to be puffed up in your mind and start only thinking about yourself. That's it. Like that's his warning in Deuteronomy 8, and he's like, don't do that. And that's like the world we live in. This is what the Bible is, the most relevant book in the world. You find yourself at one different part of it, no matter where
Yeah.
you are. And you're right. I think we live in kind of an age where we have so many options, and you're able to compare with so many people. It actually makes you feel like you're stagnant. And
Hmm.
when I talk about responsibility, I mean I think you have to start with taking responsibility for what's in front of you. So, I mean, if you just break down the word, it's your ability to respond to what's in front of you. So, like, I know plenty of people who are irresponsible and own a house. You're like, man, that thing's gonna fall down on you because you haven't taken care of anything. Um, but your first option to grow in responsibility is how you respond to what's in front of you. How do you respond to that job you don't like you were talking about? Do you own it? Do you try to get better, or do you just sit there and complain? That's your first area. You start with those little small things, and then you find you're able to handle bigger things. Um, more just maybe not necessarily more important, but just different things. Your field grows. Your field of
Hmm.
responsibility grows. Um, wow, that was a really really insightful monologue that you just went on. You also have a great historical perspective that we are good to be reminded of. I think so. One of the reasons I've like gotten into history the last couple of years is because it's very sobering to the world. The phrase "the world should be blank," like because everybody's kind of got it. No, it should be blank, or no matter what you think or what you believe, everybody's got it should be blank, and a study of history across the ages will just beat that out of you. Like,
Yeah.
there is no, it should be blank, but you should like wonder why is it that every person alive has the ability or has that question on their heart, like it shouldn't be as it currently is. Well, that's because you were meant for a different world. That's C.S. Lewis's basic argument in um, Mere Christianity. Um, But when you have a historical perspective, you're also going to be a little bit more gracious to yourself and not think, oh, I should be further along than I am. It's like, well, maybe not. Like,
Yeah.
what were you dealt in life? How have you handled what's in front of you? So, like me at 27, I can, in all honesty, say I probably should have been further along than I was, but I wasn't because I made stupid choice after stupid choice after stupid choice after stupid choice. And those three things you talked about, change major, drop out of college, and hate your job, I did all three. And like, um, like, okay, so when I was able to own it, when I was able to be like, I am not where I want to be because of my own actions. There's no one for me to blame. there's not, I don't even have to like necessarily blame myself. I just accept this is where I am, and I get to move forward. It's actually why I don't edit this podcast, is because you don't get to edit your life. I don't get to take back anything. You don't get to take back anything. You just it is what it is, and you move forward. You make the most of it and let it be. You accept your story, and um, all that to say, you that was a very very insightful monologue. I'm going to have to re-listen to, because there's like 3 or 4 episodes that I can, maybe 5, that I can just steal from what you said and make it my own. I wanted to touch on the other thing that you had mentioned. So they're not rejecting you; they're choosing a better option for themselves. Um, in I worked in young adult ministry for 6 years, and everybody between 23 and 25, that every single person had this quarter life crisis that you kind of just described. What I have to, I hate, this is not the world I thought I was going to be going after college or whatever. This is not what I thought it was going to be. Um, and with that comes a lot of, she didn't want to go out with me. He didn't want to go out with me. They didn't like me at this job for this reason. These people didn't like me, and there's like, there's just all these, like, what feels like a lot of just rejection. Um, and yours is a little bit, you're recruiting, but you said they're choosing a better option for themselves. Do you have anything to expand on that?
Um, I think um well, like, so when I first started like trying to keep that mindset, a lot of it was because I feel like I was just like, I was putting my numbers together. I'm calling this many people. I'm putting the work in, yet it's not panning out,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, well, what am I doing wrong? What's wrong with me? Maybe this isn't the job for me, whatever. But I had to start thinking. I was like, um, I tried to flip it around and just be like, okay, well, when have I turned something down, rejected something, told somebody no, and I knew 100% that I was making the right decision? So, like, job offers. I've applied for different jobs, and sometimes I had to choose between two different jobs, and I knew I was making the right decision. I knew I was, but I was rejecting somebody. And so if I think about it, like, man, I probably have these students, these 18, 17-year-old students who are telling me no, but they're making the best decision that they think they're making at that moment, and probably they are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't have the authority to say no, they're all wrong. They should come to York University. Um, I don't have I shouldn't have that much confidence in my abilities or my job, but a lot of times, most of the time, when you get rejected, the other person is probably very confident that they're making the right decision. And that happens in relationships, that'll happen in jobs, that'll happen in promotions, that'll happen a lot. And sometimes you'll be selfish, and sometimes you'll just get the the bad end of the stick, and it will not, and it won't be fun. Um, but it doesn't mean that it's like the world is falling apart, and it doesn't mean that there's not opportunities for you to learn and grow from it. Um, and so I just had to flip that around and just be like, change my mindset to just be like, okay, well, you know what? I wish you the best of luck. I know the school you're going to. I know it's a good school. I know the coach. We'll probably see each other compete. I really hope that this works out for you, and I hope to see you in the future. I hope to see you successful in the future, because if I truly want students to come to my program, to come to our school, and to grow and be successful, then I'm okay with them doing that exact same process at a different school. Now, if I just want numbers, if I just want
Yeah.
to make my, like, pad my bottom line and make me look good,
Yeah.
then yeah, of course I should be upset that they're not coming in. But if I'm honest and true with myself and be like, I will get the students I need to get, and if I trust God that I will have the students in my program, that I'll get there, that it'll happen as long as I'm working, as long as I'm doing my best, um, and as long as those things are happening, then um, it will work out for the best. And it may not seem like it is the best, but it is the best.
Yeah. Well, and you have to let go of the outcome for
Mm-hmm.
for so much. You actually can't control the outcome. for pretty much anything in your life. And I should have written it down on my little phone on my phone here because what did you say? I was like, ooh, there's something there. Oh, so even when it took, how long were you frustrated with your job before you started trying to get better at recruiting?
Um, I mean, I'm still frustrated with my job. I don't know what you're talking
Oh,
about.
okay. So, hey, well, that's fine. That's fine. So, how long you been listening to the podcast and reading and trying to get better?
um, it was probably. I mean, it's probably about maybe a year and a half ago. Like, so probably 6 to 8 months into the job, I realized, man, my numbers for this first. So basically, it was the first recruiting cycle that I had in
Mm-hmm.
2021.
Mm-hmm.
Started in January. Got to get people here by August, and I started like realizing, man, a lot of people are telling me no in this last 6 weeks. I was like, I was for sure. I was like, something's wrong. I'm doing something wrong. And then so I had to reevaluate. And then I had a second recruiting cycle that was a little bit better. And
Mm-hmm.
I was a little bit more confident in. And I was like, okay, these things are, I'm throwing these up against the wall. These things are sticking, but there's so much more that I'm not taking advantage of. And I'm not using all of my time maybe as wisely or as efficiently as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm going for a run and if I'm listening to something, I'm like, what if instead for this 30-minute run, what if I listen to a recruiting podcast instead?
Mm-hmm.
Or what if I read this article? What if I just did a little bit more? How much more would that help
Yeah.
me? And I started just kind of being okay with critiquing myself and um, but also, one thing that I did and that I have to work on is I have to set realistic goals because otherwise I'll always look like a failure. So,
Yeah, you do. You do have to do that. But hold up, before you get into realistic goals, there are three principles that you just that I'm like. So rejection made you critique yourself and figure out, okay, what do I need to actually get better at? So instead of being a victim to like, maybe I'm just not good about this, I should move. You're like, you took the rejection and you were like, what am I missing? So you looked for a way to get better. That's also an aspect of responsibility. Is you're like, I'm the only one here who's in charge of recruiting, so there's got to be something that I can do to get better. And then what was the other? Oh, investing your time. You have opportunity to listen to a podcast you want to listen to for your own pleasure, or you can use that time uh, to make you better at what you've been asked or tasked to do at this time in your life. So that's a way to invest your time, and I've done episodes of that because I'm kind of big on that, making good use of your time um, for what you've been asked or tasked to do without working 80 hours a week, because that is not a good use of time either. Unless you're an auditing accountant at a big firm and it's tax season, that is a completely good use of time. Audrey.
yeah.
Um, and I don't remember the third one, but so there's at least two principles there that you were like, okay, I'm gonna get better at this. I'm gonna turn this rejection into an opportunity to get better instead of letting it be defeating. And I'm gonna make use of my time to get better. That's good.
Yeah. And I think it was, I mean, um, I took like a principle that, I mean, I can't remember where I heard it, but I must have been in high school or something, but it didn't really click on how to adjust it. But it was something like it was it was two roses and a thorn or something like that. I don't know if you've ever heard that. Like take what's two positive takeaways and what's one negative takeaway. Like
Mm.
what are those two? And I think that I think people can take that and adjust the ratio. So that's a 2-to-1 positive negative. And if you're kind of hard on yourself and you're a little critical, yeah, maybe you should do 2-to-1. Maybe you should do 3-to-1. You have to tell yourself what you're doing good at and be honest with yourself and don't lie to yourself. So if you don't lie to yourself and you say, what are two good things that I'm doing, but also what's one thing I can do that's better? Some people are the exact opposite, and they are just so confident in their abilities that they're like,
12
I
roses,
got,
no
yeah,
thorns.
yeah. And then they got to switch it. They got to do, okay, I give myself one thorn because it makes me feel good, and or one rose, and then I'm going to do two thorns or three thorns because I got to motivate myself
Mm-hmm.
and be like, how can I actually improve in this? Um, and it's it's something that I try and think about a lot of like when I'm getting really either down on myself or like, sometimes it'll just happen where I'm talking to recruits and I get three cancels in a day. And it's been like a while since I've gotten anybody who's like a positive response or like nobody's responded to my text messages. I was like, okay, well, there goes just crossing off the list, sending those emails over to the admissions department and being like, hey, by the way, this person's not coming. I'm sorry. Like all these different things. It's kind of hard and you can beat yourself up, but it can also be like, you can be at work and you can get a reprimand or you can show up late or there's a lot of different things that you can do or that can happen that aren't your fault, that aren't anything that you could have done. It's just other people making just living their life.
Mm-hmm.
They're living their life and it's just negatively affecting you, or at least in your mindset. And you just have to say that there is a process here and there's a long-term effect. You know, like if you're, I don't know exactly the time frame on this. I don't have a kid. What's the time frame on potty training a child?
Around 2 years.
Okay, so you're coming up on it.
We're coming up on it. Thank
Yeah.
God, because
So
I'm spending every dollar I make on diapers.
yeah,
I sent Chelsea. There's somebody, a mom made one of those like reels, Instagram reels, the short videos. And it was like, how much money do you spend on diapers every month? And it cut to a clip of Biden when he had one of his Biden gaffes when he was like 700 billion trillion $1,000,000. And I was like, that's exactly what it feels like to buy diapers every 3 weeks because they just go through so many.
yeah, yeah. So if you like take that mindset and you're like, you're a parent, you're trying to teach your kid how to potty train, and they're like, at first they're like, oh, this is a cool idea. I like it. I get the cool little small miniature toilet next to the big one that mom and dad use. This is awesome. I love it. And you're like, oh, this is sweet. And all of a sudden, like you think you're good, you take the diaper off, and all of a sudden they're just pooping on your leg during a movie, and you're like, what is wrong with you, child? Are you kidding me? And I can say that because I have been pooped on and peed on it when I was babysitting when I was in high school. But that's like, it's like, you have to remember, okay, this is a process to things.
Yeah.
And things take time. And if you use any sort of statistics or math in your life at all, you have to know, like, if you're going to flip a coin, you got to get like heads in order to get tails. And it just has to equal out to 50-50. And I have to think about that in my world is that, if I got a 10% retention rate at each level, if I want to get 10 students to come to my program, I need to have 10 students or I need to have like 20 students who are accepted, which means I need to have like 40 students who apply to our school. And that means I need to call like 400 students. Like,
whoa,
that's about what the ratios are, depending, and the program changes, but that's what every coach across America is doing for college is they're having those ratios, and you're trying to think about it, and you're like, okay, well, for every rejection I get, I'm gonna get a positive, or I'm gonna get 1/10 of a positive. But it's just
that is a lot of rejection. 400 calls.
Yeah, and that's successful programs. That's not where I'm at yet. I'm talking a lot more people than that. But that's like what it happens, and you have to just remember, you have to just trust that there's a process. There's people who've done this before you. There's ways to learn. There's things that you can do, and you just have to trust yourself. That are you working hard? Are you getting up every day? And are you working hard? And are you doing everything you can? And are you maintaining a positive mindset where you're building slowly but securely? You're not just building fast and just breaking things, but you're just actually just moving forward at a good one step at a time, and you're just taking the time that you need.
Yeah. You don't want to be like that the parable where Jesus, like the seed falls among rocky soil and it springs up fast, but it has no root, so it just collapses. There's actually there's a proverb. It's probably it's top 10 for me. It's the man who tends his fig tree will eat its fruit. Fig trees don't produce fruit for about 6 years. So you're just taking care of a tree. Think about something. Could you think of anything more boring than taking care of a tree so that you can get its fruit? It takes 6 years. Um,
Yeah.
and what I'm learning, even now at 31, I think it's finally clicking for me that the only way to have any form of success, however you measure success, is diligence and not giving up.
Yeah.
Like it's like, what does it come down to? You just didn't stop trying. It's like, um, with as much. I mean, you could try forever. Like I could try forever to be an NFL player. I thought it just would never happen. But where you are, putting in effort, being diligent, is a great way to become successful. It's like the
Hmm.
way to become successful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's very hard, and it just takes a lot of time and
Yeah.
strength and courage. And I think that's what's hard is that in um, if we go back to what we were talking about earlier about young people who are entering into their adult life or whatever at 17, 18, 20,
Mm-hmm.
um, they are time up until that point. If you believe anything about Einstein, time is relative, and it seems like it's going so slow. And so you have so much time in the world to make decisions. You have so much time to do these things, and the satisfaction level, or how fast you get satisfied with things in life, is very very quick. You, because the way time moves in a kid's head, it's like you all of a sudden you're like you wake up and then all of a sudden it's nap time and then you're eating and then you're like bedtime and like what happened, and they can't comprehend that there's differences in the day. But I was thinking the other day, I was like, my gosh, it was 6 years ago that this thing happened in my photos timeline or whatever. I was like, that was 6 years ago. I feel like that was yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And but so much has happened in that time, and I wouldn't have I was 24. I was like all these, like, it was just a very very different life. And
Yeah.
then and so I think when young people think like um, that things, the work that they see people do, they see these videos, they talk to people, they say, wow, you're 35 and you've already done this, I could do that by 24. And they're like, your math is off there, bud. I'm sorry.
Way off.
One's 12 years and one's 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to rip off Einstein, time is slow, but it also moves at the speed of light. I think about that all the time. So 6 years ago, I was leaving Olive Garden to take a free internship. And then I was driving after that experience. I was driving for Lyft. And then I did internship, Lyft, rental property, personal trainer, hired at the church, 5 jobs in 1 year between 25 and halfway through 26. And then hired at the church and I made 28 grand and I was stuck there until I was 28. And then suddenly something happened and it just took off financially. But then also I got married and had a baby and moved across the country. It's like slow, 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 slow. And then like a rocket, it like takes off
Yeah.
and you just never know. And so
But in those moments, it feels like it's taking forever.
forever. Yeah.
Like,
But it's
yeah.
also moving at the speed of light. Like I had a moment with Noah today where I was like, she wanted to play, and I was like, I need to fold all this laundry because I'm like so conscientious about when stuff has to get done. I just want it taken care of. Um, that's where I've gotten in my life. I want my laundry done, and I just had a moment of like, she's only 19 months and eager for dad. Like one time,
Yeah.
I was like, I'll throw the laundry on the ground for now. I folded it later, but it's just like 6 months ago, we were celebrating her first birthday and she had just learned to walk. And she was that toy that you got her, she could like barely touch the top of it, the little walker toy. And
Mhm.
today I took a picture of it. She climbed on top of it to look out the window. I'm like, stop. So even even little moments like that, it's like, yeah, it's really, really slow, but then it's also really, really fast.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. When I read something, I mean, years ago, and it actually changed the way I think about family
mm.
so much.
Ooh, I'm all
And
about it.
this person was saying, don't ever think about how much time you have left with a person, whether it's your parents, your friends, your siblings, whatever. Don't ever think about how much time you have left, because you got an infinite amount of time. Like, whether it's you're counting in minutes, you're counting in seconds, you're counting days, years, doesn't matter. You got a lot of time left.
Mm.
And so you don't do anything with it. But if you think about the moments that you have,
Mm.
how many times, and so he's asking this person who's during an interview, they're asking, how many times do you see your parents a year? And they're like, I've seen like 2 to 3 times. And he's like, and how old are they? And he's like, they're about 70. And he's like, okay, so you will see your parents probably 10 more times before they die. And he's like, oh, that's really sad.
That is a depressing comment.
Yeah. And so if you think about our parents, and that's why I was like,
I'd rather not.
yeah. But that changed for me, because I was like, man, this is very, very important to me. I
Mm-hmm.
love visiting my family. I love hanging out with my family. And if I do the math, I could count very quickly how many times more I get to see my family in my
Mm-hmm.
life. More in their
Guaranteed,
life.
Dad's crying right now.
I know. And it kind of sucks if you think about it, but it's so important to remember that,
Mm-hmm.
and to make the most of those moments. So just like you're talking about with Noah, is you will be able to fold more laundry more times in your life than you'll be able to see, like, play with your 19-month-old
Right.
daughter.
Right.
And even when your kid, your second kid, even when he's 19 months old, it's not going to be the same. It's going to be awesome.
Right.
It's not going to be the same.
Yeah.
And that like completely changed the way I think about things. Is like, I only get so many times to do something, and it's kind of easy to think like, like I joke with my wife all the time, like, yeah, I've got 80 more years or whatever, because I keep joking that we're gonna live to 110. I don't know. I hope so, but probably not.
Hey, that's a better joke than I tell my wife. I tell her she's got like 30 years with me left. She hates it. Like, don't talk like that.
I tell odds that we'll live for 80 more years, but I'll be in a walker in about 5. So she can. But you think about it, and you're like, okay, how many more times? Like you could count, like, oh, for 80 more years I get to wake up next to my wife or whatever. Or you could probably count up, okay, how many more times do I get to go to bed with her, when we're not stressed or tired? Like those few moments that you have that are like, oh, this is awesome. And you're like, yeah, I can just like roll over, get on my phone. I mean, I wonder how many YouTube videos I can swipe through, or how much longer can I just lay here and just enjoy this moment? And it's kind of like, I don't know, it's just hard to sometimes put things in perspective and make things like relative to each other.
Yeah.
But
you and we're talking like we're 60 years old. We're young.
Well, I think it's important to think like you're old while you're still young, because then you act as if you have limited
wisdom
time,
is with the prudent. That's right.
So
that's like, so because I mean, in a world where the number one draw for people under 30 is to be successful, that's the number one thing people list. Like, what do you want in your life? I want to be successful. Successful, financially secure, independent. Top 3 things, according to I think it's Barna, when they surveyed a bunch of Gen Z people under 30. Those were the top 3 things they wanted. Marriage wasn't even in the top 10. Friendships, I think, was like number 9. Hyper individualistic. When you start to think about like what actually matters in life, and when you start to figure, hey, where am I going to take responsibility? Where am I going to invest my time? What am I going to waste my time arguing about? Or any of the number of things that we talked about on this podcast. What it comes down to is you get a few moments with people who are special in your life that matter the most, which is why, like, on this podcast, we talk about start with your family. If work is your number one priority, you're out of order. Start with your family. then your church, and then your work. And it is the most satisfying way to live. Maybe less glory, but every successful person I know. I went through the YouTube channel, the Motivation Hub. Have you heard of this YouTube channel?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, Almost every single person on there that was like uber successful and had a motivation video had ruined their family. Like every single one. I was like, wow, you that is one way to forfeit your soul and gain the world. This is like, but there's like millions of views. And you're like, oh, just maybe it's not good advice. But
Yeah.
speaking
Yeah.
of though, because it's 9:44 where I am, and I'm sure my wife is eager for me to come join her. And we've had that hour and 25 minutes. That was a great conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I don't usually re-listen to these podcasts because I don't want to hear my own voice, but I want to re-listen to that because you had some gold in there, and very very fascinating. So thank you for coming on. We'll have to have you on again. This one will probably be in the top 5. Poor Dylan.
Maybe.
Dylan hasn't cracked the top 5 yet. I don't think. Actually, let me look. So,
Oh well, here actually for one comment I had, you and Dylan on when you guys recorded for his podcast,
Yep.
which check him out. I know he's on YouTube. I can't find him anywhere else on the podcast apps I listen to, but
he changed his name. Coffee with Dylan.
oh man, that's what I thought I searched, but because I listen to I listen to his on YouTube and I listen to yours through Spotify, but I listen to all my other podcasts on Pocket Cast. But you guys were talking about books. Dylan was talking about books that he reads every year.
Yeah.
And one book that I think everybody should add to their list every single year, and actually probably every single month because it's so short, is reading the book of Ecclesiastes.
100. Yes.
I read it. That's probably the book I've read the most.
What's your favorite chapter?
Bible.
In Ecclesiastes, chapter 9. Man.
I don't know. Probably. I don't think so. I don't know. I don't think I have a favorite because I just like for me, that's been like probably the most perspective changing book that I have or book that I read is just because too often we think that our world is so much better or so much worse than it's ever been before. And it's like, nah, sorry, dude. It's not.
Not even close.
Nope. It's exactly the same. What if I told you that? What if it was exactly the same?
Yeah.
Like the details have changed.
Yeah.
The colors have changed. That's it. But none of that matters. But everything else, the problems that you have is exactly the same. And that no matter what, it's all the same. And it's all going to be the same forever. And until Jesus comes back down and everything. But it's like, it's a very interesting thing to think about. So I recommend people read that as much as possible.
I agree. So my last couple Wisdom Wednesday podcasts have been out of Ecclesiastes. I love it. The reason I said chapter 9 is because it says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Well, no, that is chapter 9. Because it's before that it says, enjoy the wife with the one, or enjoy your life with the wife that you love. And whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. That's a good recommendation.
Yeah. And then since you're like doing this like history experience, I guess, go to an old bookstore. Okay. And find a book from decades ago. Find a book that explained the world at that moment. So find a book from like the 1960s and it's written in find a book that was written in 1962 about, okay. And it's a very, very specific subject of like, okay, here's the problems we are having at this time that will revolutionize the world, and just read it and just think, this is what people thought was like the biggest deal. And it actually wasn't. And it's actually like, it's crazy to think about. And so I have a few books that I have a big pile of books that I have to read or get rid of because our bookshelf is full. And so a bunch of them are like that. It's like, okay, what is the city? One of them is like a city planning book. Like, okay, the problems of Detroit city planning in the 1950s. Here's the problems that we have to fix right now. I'm not saying if they fixed their city, they wouldn't have gone bankrupt 10 years ago, but but it's like very interesting to think of like, this is what somebody sat down and they wrote, and this got published, and this was read, and this was like so important at the
Mm-hmm.
time. And what are we writing or reading now that's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh man, this like doomsday stuff actually probably doesn't matter. Or
Yeah.
it's just interesting to think about how people thought, 70 years ago
Mm-hmm.
about the world around them. So,
I literally just bought a history book called Doom by a guy named Neil Ferguson. He's one of my favorite historians to read. He's a fascinating historian. Um, and so this book Doom is called The Politics of Catastrophe, and he examines different catastrophes throughout history and how people responded.
mm,
And he wrote it during the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. Um,
oh yeah,
but that's actually a really good piece of wisdom. Go buy something that's really old. My favorite historian to read is a guy named Paul Johnson. He was a Christian guy who wrote really, really good history books. His things that he was analyzing are actually still playing out because I think he wrote most of his books in the 70s and 80s. So, which is like 40 years now, so it's not that old. But I do have that Theodore Roosevelt book that he wrote called Fear God and Take Your Own Part, which is first chapter is all about how do you love your neighbor as a nation, but then the rest of it is what he thinks should be America's response to Germany in World War One, and how mad he was at Woodrow Wilson. He's pissed at Woodrow Wilson.
yeah,
He'll occasionally go on these long monologues, but that's a great example of like this was the most pressing issue at the time,
hmm
and well,
yeah.
we've
And,
come
and
and
if you
gone
think,
100 years
you
ago.
look at, yeah, you read a book like that was written 1915, 1918. When was that book written?
That one
Around
was
there?
19. I think he probably wrote it in 1914 actually, because it was the United States was not in the war yet, and he was
Mm.
mad at how Woodrow Wilson responded to the bombing of the Lufthansa, I think is how you say it.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. So yeah, so if you like read a book like that with that historical context, and then you go like on Wikipedia and you look at like, oh, what things were happening
Mm-hmm.
in 1914, or what things were happening in 1919 that were like new for the time
Mm-hmm.
that hadn't happened before,
Yeah,
and then you're like, wait a minute, like this hadn't happened yet. Like you're just trying to think of like, man, they weren't like this wasn't a problem yet.
great.
Like these things didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Like there wasn't like, and you look at like, then you look at big institutions that are so important in today's day and age
Mm-hmm.
that we can't live without, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the FDIC, since we were talking about it earlier,
Yeah.
didn't exist yet. It didn't exist for 40 more years. Like, this is 1950s, right?
No, great.
Oh, that was
No,
Great
it
Depression.
was part of the New Deal.
Yeah, so 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So 20, like there's just things that hadn't happened yet. Um, and then like how people got around, what the day in the life was like for somebody in that age, and it just gives you so much historical context to why this was
Yeah.
important, or and that's why I like kind of reading those lower level, like the city of Detroit, the city planning. Nobody's reading that except city planners in maybe
You.
Chicago,
Yeah,
or like
and you.
yeah, and so
You read about
or like
so.
reading books about the internet in 1997,
Oh yeah, I
and they're
bet that.
reading they're, they're reading those, and it's like, man, the words that they use to describe everything's like e dash,
Mm-hmm.
and but it's like they describe like the effects of this on society and like what it is, and you're like, you can think about it like, oh wow, they were so wrong, but it's like, why were they thinking this way, and what are we thinking about today
Mm-hmm.
that we're just going to be wrong about in 20 years?
Yeah, or at least most of us will be wrong. There's going to be some savant who nailed it. I
Yeah,
can't wait to read about the history of the iPhone. Like 40 years from now, I hope I'm around to read about the year 2007 and
yeah.
how it changed the world, because that's one of those monumental moments that it actually did change the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
Like you get to bank, everybody banks on their phone now. That's what, 16 years old that you can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good recommendation. Read really old books to give yourself a historical perspective. Like what were the problems? I looked it up. That book he wrote was in 1916. That's also when Shackleton was stuck down in Antarctica.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
yeah, and no one knew, just him.
Yep.
That's a great book for read endurance. Man, that's a good book. But all right, well, let's wrap this up. Collin, thanks for coming on. Everybody, thank you for listening to the Man I Want to Be podcast. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a 5-star review. If you didn't like what you heard, just pretend you didn't listen at all. That helps us out just as much. And until next time, this is the Man I Want to Be podcast.